I met Roger about 15 years ago through a good friend of mine, horn player named Thomas Jostline. And I thought when we came up with this plan that Roger would be the perfect guy to do the Chicago school. So I called him and we chatted about the project and he was all in. And here he is today to enlighten us on the Chicago school. Thank you, Roger Rocco.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I want to thank you, Mike, and everyone that's involved in this for the opportunity to for me to keep a promise that I made to Jake in 1998. I got word during the summer, it was July of 1998, that Jake wanted to talk to me, wanted to speak to me. He was giving his seminar at Northwestern at the time, and so I called Brian Fredrickson, who is his assistant at the time, and the author of the book Song and Wind. And we arranged a lunch with Gizzy and Brian and myself the next day. And it was a wonderful opportunity to spend some time with him. But I sensed that his health was failing. He could barely walk. His eyesight was almost gone. Gizzy was carrying around an oxygen bottle. And right at the end of the meeting, I could just look in his eyes. And if you ever spend any time with Jake, you could read his face. You could read his eyes, would tell you volumes about what was going on in his mind. And I could sense that he was kind of communicating to me. And my very last words to him were that his work would live through his students. And it's a promise that I made then, and it's a promise that I've devoted my life to keeping. And this is a wonderful opportunity for me to keep that promise. So here we are. I want to let the audience know that what you see is not as important as what you're going to hear. Although there are going to be 3 pictures that I'm going to present, and they'll be recorded, and you'll be able to look at them, later on. But I'm a senior citizen now, and so one of the first things to go when you're a senior citizen is your short-term memory. So I have 6 pages of notes here because I know I would forget things. But what's important is what you hear, and what's important in my teaching. I pay little attention to what I see with the students. As a matter of fact, most of the time I either look away or close my eyes. But I'm very, very keen on what I'm hearing, because that's what the message is. It's the sound, it's an auditory message. And the auditory message for me is much greater than anything that I would see. So the visual is not important. But there will be 3 pictures that I'm going to show during this time. So the thank you. As a lifelong brass player, I have experienced the joy of Mount Everest, but I've also experienced the despair and disappointment of Death Valley. I devoted my entire career to leading others out of Death Valley. And I have a message for quite a few people that have been contacting me this last few days, because there's been a lot of publicity about this, and it's all over the world. So people are contacting me, and I have a message for them. And I can't cover this subject today because there's no time. But these are suffering brass players, and they're contacting me about focal dystonia. And here's the brief message that I have for them. I'm not going to go into anything other than just to say, focal dystonia is a treatable symptom, not an incurable disease. And that'll be the subject for another time, maybe. But Jake would like to tell a story. I lost your picture, Mike. Jake liked to tell a story, and he expressed the music in the story. And so I've structured our time together like an opera. It's not a Wagnerian opera, so don't get nervous. I know we don't have the time. I call it a petite opera. And this opera has a title, like all operas have a title. And here's the title of today's opera. The music tells us everything we need to know. The trumpet is only a middleman between the mind and the audience. Now, the opera also has an overture, and the overture has a title. You don't need to know anything about anatomy but you need to know a lot about music. So the four acts, just to summarize, the first act is truth, myth, and evolution. There's a lot of all of that in Jacob's story. Act two, we live in two different worlds. I'm going to be talking about this conscious awareness versus the subconscious awareness. Act three, input versus output, sensory awareness versus motor function. Act four, methodology. How do we apply, how do we motivate the function? The methodology that I've developed is, I call it sing, buzz, play. But the great Bud Herseth summarizes it beautifully, and I will refer back to that. Then there's the finale ultimo, about 60 seconds where Jake tells the story. I want to begin with Act one, myth. The biggest myth about Jake and his work was that he had one lung. I'm going to take care of that problem now. He did not have one lung. He had two lungs, but his vital capacity was reduced because of severe asthma. It's a condition that he had to deal with his whole life, his entire life. He had to deal with anatomy was to help himself understand what he could do to survive that and still be a wonderful musician, a brass player. The second myth has to do with this book that this is one of the pictures that I will hold up to the camera today. This is the book Song and Wind. And we see Jake with a big, huge, mindless tube in his hands. That tube is at the end of his mouthpiece. I was one of the co-authors, not co-authors, but contributors to the book. Brian was the author, and by the way, it was edited by John Taylor, who was my first teacher. And there were several of us who contributed to the book over a period of a few years. We would send copy back and forth to Brian. Brian compiled it. When it came time to publish the book, I mentioned to Brian, I said, we should have big, bold type song, and it's much smaller type wind. The myth is that Arnold Jacobs was mostly about the wind. That's absolutely not true. Because he realized that his audience was misinformed, misunderstanding. Arnold Jacobs, the master of wind? No, it was Arnold Jacobs, the master of song. And what was song? It was musical awareness. I recently saw a video of his exact words where he says on the video, the song is 85%, the wind is only 15%. A lot of people think that the wind is 85% and the song, who knows? But I want to communicate or read two very, very important statements. I think these are the two most powerful statements that I ever heard from him. First statement, there are two instruments, one in the hands and one is a mirror reflecting the one in the head. Wow. I recently had an opportunity to spend some time with the wonderful, great new principal trumpeter of the Chicago Symphony, Esteban. Plus with David Cooper, the new principal horn of the Chicago Symphony. These are great, some of the finest brass players in the world, young brass players, and we had wonderful conversation. And what came from that conversation was the statement. It's not about the trumpet or the horn. It's about the music. The second most important statement that I ever heard from Jake were these words: I sing the notes in my head as I play them. It doesn't matter how my lip feels or how I feel. It doesn't matter how his lip feels. There's something out there that I resist, which I call the feel-good approach to brass playing. That we have to feel right. We have to feel good first before we can actually play. And one of the things that I say is that no, feel good is a byproduct, not a motivator. It does not motivate, but it's a byproduct. You can't want to feel good first. We'll talk more about that as we go along. So the two myths, that it really wasn't about song, and he had one lung. And what about the myth of the wind? He says only 15%. And what does that mean? So simple. Take a big breath and renew it often, because it's easier to produce a good sound when playing from full, and avoid attempting to play from a shallow breath because it's more difficult. That's it. That's the essence of what he meant by the wind. Take a big breath and avoid attempting to play from a shallow breath. One of the things that Rocco says is that you already know how to take a deep breath. You're just not used to doing it with a mindless tube in your hands. The brain already knows how to move air in and out of the lungs. We're all master breathers. We don't have to study anatomy. We don't have to sit in front of mirrors and study charts and diagrams. Well, I will show you a diagram, and I'm not going to even explain it, but there's two diagrams here, and I know it's going to be recorded. So if anybody wants to revisit this on the recording, they'll be able to do so. And let's see if I can. Here's the first one. And here's the second one. So it'll be recorded. So the first diagram is the airflow diagram, and the second diagram is the air pressure diagram. I'm laughing because my graduate students at Vandercook insisted that I provide some of this analytical stuff. So I gave them pictures. But the first diagram means this: take a big breath and play to about half full. After you reach 50% of your lung capacity or vital capacity, your ability to use that air diminishes rapidly until you get to the last third of your capacity, and it's basically useless, impossible to play. The second diagram has to do with airflow and air pressure, and all that means is this: low notes, the characteristic of low notes is beneficial for tone production, and the characteristic of high notes is detrimental. That's all that diagram means. So the first diagram means take a big breath and renew it often. The second diagram means low notes are a powerful, healthy tool to encourage tone production. That's it. So I'm not even going to spend any time there. If anybody wants to look at it, it'll be on the video. You already know how to take a deep breath. You're just not used to doing it. In that picture, I'm going to hold this book up again. We see song and wind. What we don't see is anything about embouchure analysis. Nothing. There's not a word about embouchure analysis there. So Jacob says 85% song, which is musical awareness. Song is the musical awareness. 15% wind, take a big breath and renew it often. Embouchure analysis, 0%. His words. I never even considered the embouchure. He used to enjoy doing a demonstration where he would take his mouthpiece and move it all over his face. But actually, I think he did it with a rim. And he'd move it all over his face and he'd play a melody, and you could hear the melody no matter where it occurred. He never even considered the embouchure. And why is that? Well, here I can backtrack a little bit because when he was a young man, he was probably 10 years old or younger. He came home from the Boy Scouts one day with a bugle. No one's had any idea how to play the bugle. His mother was a trained pianist, a fine musician. She didn't know how to play the bugle, but she went to the piano and she played the notes. And all he did was imitate the sound of the piano. That was it. No teacher. But at some point he switched to the trumpet. He became a trumpet player, and he says these words. This is Jacobs talking now. I was a very fine trumpet player until the first teacher came along. What was the problem there? Paralysis by analysis. The analytical teacher came along and was more concerned about how to play the trumpet than the music or the sound of the trumpet. Well, he eventually switched to the trombone. Now, I never really got a clear answer why he went from the trumpet to the trombone, but I strongly suspect that it was to get away from the trumpet teacher, the analytical trumpet teacher. He saw a trombone in a pawn shop. This is in the time of the Depression, late 20s, early 30s, saw a trombone in there. And he begged his mother to buy the trombone for $10. And that was a big deal during the Depression, to buy a trombone for $10. She bought him a trombone for $10. I think it was to get away from that teacher, but I don't know for sure. But anyway, I do know that he won a full scholarship to Curtis on the trombone at 15, at the age of 15. Now, the family's in California. They're going to move to Philadelphia. That's a long drive in an open car on them. There's no interstate highways. It takes about a week to make that trip. And of course, they have to stop and, spend the night in restaurants and that stuff. One time they came out of a restaurant and the trombone, which was strapped to the side of the car, was gone. Somebody stole the trombone. He gets to Philadelphia, no trombone. But he's on the scholarship. He brought the whole family to Philadelphia. Well, we have a tuba. It goes from the bugle to the trombone, to the trumpet, to the tuba. And he talks about the fact that, he mentions the fact that the first time he put the mouthpiece on his face, it felt like a coffee cup, a huge mouthpiece, going from the trumpet to the bugle, like a coffee cup. Well, 3 years later, he turns down the Boston Symphony. He turned down the Boston Symphony at the age of 18 after playing the tuba for 3 years. What we're learning here is that the instrument didn't matter. The instrument didn't matter what was in hands. During the time of the Depression, he supported the family in Philadelphia by playing tuba in ballroom orchestras. Well, they developed a microphone, and the band leader, orchestra leader, came to Jake one day and he said, Jake, they developed a new microphone. Can you play the string bass? He's supporting his family during the Depression. He said, of course. He never played a string bass in his life. Never in his life. He acquired a string bass, put chalk marks on the fingerboard, and kept a job in the ballroom orchestra. The instrument didn't matter. It didn't matter what instrument was there, because what did matter was the music. And he had a powerful awareness of the music. From the beginning, from the time that he would listen to his mother play the piano to the time that all the experiences that occurred later in life. He became a master solfege artist. He developed his skill at Curtis. He would sit in the classroom with Marcel Tabito, the principal oboe, and wonderful musicians around him. It was always about musical awareness. That was the secret to what he was about. It wasn't about embouchure analysis. So one of the things that I say is that the audience doesn't care how your chops feel, so neither should you. However, they do care about how you sound, and so should you. So we need to focus on what you sound like, not what you feel like. Another Roccoism, feel good, feel and fail are 4-letter words to a brass player. If you're more concerned about how you feel, you will fail. As a matter of fact, literally all my teaching now is people contacting me because their playing feels awful and they want to feel better. And I understand that. But the paralysis and discomfort that they do feel is a symptom of something else. And we have to fix the something else. We have to understand what's causing them to feel so lousy. But we don't treat the symptoms, we always treat the disease. So feeling comfortable when you play is a byproduct of excellent performance, but it's not a motivator. Another picture. This is from my good friend Tim Kent's book, Within the Sphere of the Master. And we see Bud and Jake and Tim on the cover there. I was very fortunate to play brass quintet music with Tim, and also another wonderful trumpet player, Steve Hendrickson. And here's a picture of Bud. Make sure you can see it. And the caption there is, "This is what my chops feel like after a concert." And he's making that face. What he doesn't say is, "This is what my chops feel like during the concert." And there's an important difference there, because he doesn't care what his chops feel like during the concert. If you don't know, he was involved in a very, very severe car accident and was severely injured. And instead of taking time off, he played through it. But this is a story, a very important story that I want to tell you, because this is something that helped him to understand how to move to the next level as, I think, the greatest orchestral trumpet player ever lived. Beethoven Ninth Symphony, Chicago Symphony, live broadcast on a Sunday afternoon. A live broadcast on TV, on television in Chicago. He's warming up in his home in Oak Park, and he can't play. Can't play. What are most people going to do? They're going to call the personnel manager and say, "Listen, have Vince play or Will Scarlett play or something. It's not working out today." Nope. This great man had tremendous strength of character and courage. He goes on the stage anyway. Fritz Reiner, Chicago Symphony. And guess what? The notes came out. He could play. He could play on the stage. A very important lesson there. And here's a message from him. There's nothing wrong with your chops. Your mind is messing them up. There's nothing wrong with your chops. Your mind is messing them up. He understood that if he focused completely on the music, that it didn't matter how his chops felt, because the input would be overwhelmed by the musical output associated with the music. Very important concept. There's a wonderful brass player, tubist. His name is Sergio Carolino. Some of you know that name, some of you are not familiar. But I would strongly urge everyone to seek him out on YouTube. And he published a book recently that I wrote the introduction for this book. I was privileged to write the introduction. The book is called Mind versus Metal. Mind versus Metal. And there's a wonderful statement that Sergio, powerful statement that he said to me. "I don't care much about tubas because they don't have a brain. It's not that mindless tube in his hands. I don't care about the mindless tube." So the first time I met Sergio was about 5 years ago. Gene Picorni recommended I go down to the University of Illinois and hear him give a performance down there in a master class. Sat on the stage, there was just a few of us on the stage. Basically, it was Mickey Moore's euphonium and tuba class. We're on the stage, and he played 4 magnificent pieces perfectly. These are pieces that no one else could play. They were written for him. And at the end of the performance of those 4 pieces, I jumped up off out of my chair and I ran up to him like a crazy person. He didn't know who I was, but I knew, and I didn't know who he was, but I said these words. I called that transcending the instrument. Those were the first words. And he looked back at me. And from that moment, we became very, very good friends, lifelong friends. And so it's an honor to know him. But he doesn't care about the instrument, but he cares a lot about the music. He cares only about the music. So we talked about the evolution of Jacobs, the truths, myths. Actually, I didn't quite complete the evolution of Jacobs, but I will talk about that at the end a little bit. I'm going to move to Act 2. And I titled this act, We Live in Two Different Worlds. We live in an external world that we're aware of through the 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, feel, and all that. But there's another internal universe that we live in that we actually know nothing about or very little about. It's the world within our bodies. And we pay no attention to it, usually, until something goes wrong. Unfortunately, I had a lot go wrong in the last 3 or 4 years, and so I had to pay a lot of attention to my internal body. But unless something goes wrong, I get a stomach ache, I have a muscle cramp or something, we pay no attention to the internal world. But the mind is absolutely in control of the internal universe. But it's a part of the mind that we have little awareness of, the subconscious mind, subconscious brain. There's a book that I recommend. Again, I'll hold this up. This will be on the video. It's called The Secret of the Ages by Robert Collier. It's The Secret of the Ages. Here's the secret. The subconscious mind is infinitely more powerful than conscious intellect. Infinitely more powerful. It's what keeps us alive, controls all our bodily functions without any conscious intellect involved. There are creatures all over this planet that function beautifully in the world with little or no conscious intellect at all. It's always a subconscious function. So the subconscious mind is infinitely more powerful. Provides life support and allows us to function in our everyday lives. We walk and talk without knowing anything about how we do this, mechanically or intellectually. And I always tell my students, what would happen if your subconscious brain decided to take the day off? And the substitute brain, the conscious intellect, had to take over all the functions of life support and everything else we do. Well, we hit the floor immediately. So the subconscious brain is extremely much more powerful than the conscious awareness. But with all the self-analysis that we see in the pedagogy, we are going to bypass the power of the subconscious brain and substitute conscious intellect. When we do that, we fail because we're substituting weakness for strength. We want to motivate strength, and that's what this is about. Not substitute weakness for strength, but motivate the strength of the subconscious brain. And we do this every single waking moment of our lives. And when we're not awake, our subconscious brain is always awake, keeping us alive and taking care of the internal universe. So how do we communicate to the subconscious brain? Well, it's very simple. So simple. As a matter of fact, a lot of criticism of this is it's so simplistic. But it's really a simplistic approach to complex motor function. We have a simplest approach. We wake up in the morning, we get out of bed. We walk, we talk. We don't analyze. We don't make it an intellectual endeavor. But we communicate to our subconscious brain, I want to say these words. I want to walk from here to there. I want to lift this pencil. I'm communicating to my subconscious. I'm not analyzing, how do I do that? Well, one of the things that Jake and Bud and all these great musicians are telling us is that we got to get out of the way of that self-analysis. Bud says it's amazing what the chops can do if we don't get in the way with all this self-analysis. Again, I come back to that phrase that both Bud and Jake, paralysis by analysis. There's a book by Barry Green called, his bass player, The Inner Game of Music, and he says, wouldn't you like to function with the ease of a child? Children are not intellectual, analytical thinkers. Children are doers. And of course, Jake says the same thing. He says, we must have the mind of a child. They're not intellectual thinkers, they are doers. Act 3, input versus output, sensory awareness versus motor function. So we're communicating with the world, the external world, through the sensors. The most powerful sense of communication, the most input that we get is through the eyes, sight. And the part of the brain that receives that message is enormous. It's an enormous part of the brain. Then the next most powerful aspect is auditory sound. We receive information to the brain from sound. Then we have feel as the third input to the brain in terms of prioritize it. It's a weaker sense. Less information comes into the brain by feel, and smell and taste follow that. But we operate on a one-way street. We're driving down a one-way street. We can't send messages and receive messages powerfully at the same time. We can receive messages very, very powerfully. We can send messages from the brain to the muscle tissue in a powerful way, but we can't do them both at the same time. I use these analogies. We're driving down a one-way street. We can't go in two directions at the same time. Or another analogy that I use is that water flows freely through a garden hose, but only in one direction. It can't flow freely in two directions at the same time. One of the trumpet players, a wonderful musician that I've worked with over the last 10 years or so, his name is Eric Highland. He's co-principal trumpet in Mexico City. And he said these two words to me, and I almost fell off the chair. You can't sit on the stage and in the audience at the same time. You can't be a producer of sound and a listener of sound at the same time. You can't be focusing on input and creating output at the same time. Jacob says we must give dominance to the music, not the instrument. Dominance to the music. And again, I want to remind you of those words that came out of that discussion with Esteban and David Cooper, but especially Esteban, because I spent a lot of time with Esteban. I walked into this during the cold of winter. I walked into the front door of his apartment building on Michigan Avenue over there. And we talked outside, shivering for hours, like two little kids sharing this information. But what came from that was that it's not about the trumpet, it's about the music. That's where the dominance has to be. So I come back to the personal. I'm going to backtrack to personal here a little bit. 1966. I'm not going to go into how I got there, but I was invited over to Jake's house on the south side of Chicago. And by the way, I'm from Chicago, and I lived and grew up a half hour from his house. And one day I walk into a 17-year-old kid, senior year of high school. I walk into his studio on Normal Avenue in Chicago. And by the way, I tell people that if you didn't take your lessons in that house, in the basement of that studio, you didn't get the full picture. It was different than downtown. I'm not going to go into that now. But he didn't do anything. He just asked me to play for him. And something occurred after about 30 minutes. He just listened. But there was an incredible commitment, a commitment of a full scholarship. And he says, I'm going to put you in the civic orchestra after listening to the 17-year-old kid play for about a half hour. And he said these words. I'll never forget these words, but I didn't understand them at the time. You sound like you already have been studying with me for 3 years. That's the why. He said, this is the reason why. You already sound like you've been here studying with me for 3 years. I didn't understand the significance of that until later. The significance was that I had already been studying with him for 3 years. But not only him, but the entire Chicago Symphony sound. From the time I was a freshman in high school, I had the opportunity to go and hear the orchestra and sit in the gallery of Orchestra Hall before they ruined the acoustics. And the sound shot up to the gallery, the Chicago sound, the Chicago Symphony sound shot up to that gallery where I was sitting as an impressionable high school student. And for 3 years, every day, I went home and imitated that sound. It was not only him, but it was the entire orchestra. I call it the Chicago sound. And so by the time that I walked into that studio, that sound was already present in my playing. And it impressed him. That's why he made that commitment to me. So it was the sound that motivated function. And we come back to what Bud says. Think sound, not mechanics. And what Rocco says, sound motivates function. Here's another important quote by Jack. What you sound like is not as important as knowing what you should sound like. You have to know what you should sound like, and that has to be the focal point. And that's what motivated my achievement as a young player. And he opened doors of opportunity for me that I'm not going to go into now. But first time I played with the Chicago Symphony, I was 18 years old and I was still in high school. And I became his assistant for 6 years. And Brian Fredrickson was his assistant away from the orchestra. Brian recorded over many years the lectures and the master classes. And he made those available. And many of them are on his website. And we all need to be thankful to Brian for doing that, for assisting Jake. But there's another name that I want to mention here because it just came to me. A man named John Svianovich, a wonderful trumpet player in Chicago. And John, Jake, after he retired, his health deteriorated rapidly. He got to the point where he couldn't walk, and his sight was deteriorating very badly. And there was no way that he could drive downtown. He wasn't teaching at home anymore to the studio downtown. So for 10 years, John Svianovich, twice a week, drove Jake downtown to the downtown studios. But John told me it was a wonderful opportunity. He says, I got 3 lessons, and I didn't have to pay for any of them. I got a lesson on the drive downtown, I got a lesson in the studio, and I got another lesson on the way home. Actually, he got 4 lessons because we would talk about the lessons. He would contact me and we would discuss what actually occurred in the lessons. So he got 4 lessons over 10 years. It was wonderful. But we have to be thankful for John because there would have been no teaching the last 10 years. There was no way that he could go there. Act 4. There are acoustical laws that must be obeyed. Jake's words. There are acoustical laws that must be obeyed. We have this mindless tube in our hands, and by the way, it's already full of air. It would be ridiculous. I'm going to hold this up again. We see that enormous tube in Jake's hands. To say to him, fill that instrument with air. There's two reasons why that's absolutely absurd. Number one, his vital capacity was around 2 liters, maybe 2.5 liters at that time. And the capacity of that tuba was probably 30 liters. So for him to fill that instrument with air was ridiculous. Number two, these tubes that we have at the end of our mouthpieces are already full of air. We don't have to fill them with air. They're already full of air. And some people say, well, you have to move the air. But who knows more than a horn player that there's very little motion of the air? They have their hand in the bell. They can feel the air. There's very little motion of the air in the bell of the horn. So it's not about motion of the air, not filling the instrument with air. What's absent there is sound. The tube doesn't have any sound. So Jake is saying, I'm not filling the instrument with air, I'm filling it with vibration. I fill it with vibration. And Rocco says that's just a mindless tube at the end of your mouthpiece. Well, it's not just any vibration. If you're playing the mouthpiece outside the tube, it could be the mouthpiece, you can create any vibration within the mouthpiece, any frequency. Once we put the mouthpiece in the tube, though, we're locked into acoustical laws, and that's the harmonic series, and we have to be very specific there. We have to send specific sound and specific music to the trumpet. By the way, the tube is just a double bass trumpet. They're all the same, just a different tube. So we have to be more specific. So we have to have musical awareness. So I'm talking about the methodology now in Act 4. What is the methodology to make this work? Well, we need a vivid musical awareness, conscious musical awareness. And I mentioned that Jake was a master solfege artist. Didn't matter what instrument he had in his hand, but he always had a powerful awareness to music. If you have a powerful awareness, conscious volition, he uses the term volitional thought, volitional awareness of the music, you have the possibility to have a mental commitment to that awareness. A mental commitment to the musical awareness. If you have those two elements, what can follow is the powerful execution or physical commitment. So many people want to change the order of these elements. And I say the order of these elements cannot be rearranged. You can't decide you're going to put the physical commitment, give it a priority over musical awareness. Because if you do that, there will be no mental commitment. So the order of these three elements, musical awareness, mental commitment, and execution, that's the order of achievement. We can't rearrange them. If we do, we'll attempt to bypass the power of the subconscious with weak intellect. And that is prevalent in the pedagogy. It's not prevalent in the great players. And by the way, many times the great players aren't really aware of why they're able to execute. But they all have a powerful awareness of the music. You cannot put the physical commitment ahead of the mental commitment. And the mental commitment cannot occur if there's not a powerful awareness. So there's something I call the ladder of awareness. And it was actually, I would describe to students, I want you to imagine a physical ladder. And I would point to a corner and I said, well, call this the ladder of awareness. I want you to imagine a ladder there. Many years ago, I was giving a master class at Western Michigan University. And one of my students, Andy Miller, a very fine tubist with the Alabama Symphony, invited me. And I said, well, I want you to find the tallest ladder you could find and put it on the stage. And so he did. He guessed the janitors, the physical plant. Give me a ladder. And I walked out there and there was a 20-foot ladder on the stage. It was wonderful. I call it the ladder of awareness. And what's that about? Well, we want to move up that ladder of awareness to create a powerful commitment and a powerful execution. And ideally, we want to be at the top of the ladder. So I used the symbolism and I talked about it for many, many years. And one time, one of my students, her name is Catherine Carroll, a very fine trombonist and phone player. She actually made the ladder for me. And she got a step ladder and she painted it. And then I said, well, it's hard to get on the airplane with that. So she made a miniature one so that I could put in my briefcase. And Mr. Rocco's ladder of awareness. How do we move up this ladder of awareness? Let's come back to not Jacob's, but Bud's words, powerful words. This is the most powerful statement I ever heard from Herseth. And by the way, I was very fortunate to spend a lot of time there. Very fortunate. When encountering problems technically or musically, first sing vocally, buzz the mouthpiece, then transfer the singing and buzzing to the trumpet. The most powerful statement that I ever heard from him. Sing vocally, buzz the mouthpiece, transfer the singing and buzzing to the trumpet. There's not a word there about error, embouchure, analysis. As a matter of fact, I have to tell you that in all the years that I worked with Bud and so on, I never heard him say one word about error or embouchure. Never said one single word. And so one of the things I found out fairly recently, probably a couple of years ago, was that Bud did a lot of, Tim Kent told me this too, but Bud did a lot of mouthpiece playing. When they had double rehearsals, everybody went out for lunch downtown between the rehearsals. Bud brought a bag lunch, and he found a practice room down there, and he practiced the mouthpiece during the entire break between the two rehearsals. One of the things he says is practice entire sessions on the mouthpiece alone. I'm encouraging that. Entire sessions on the mouthpiece alone. And it's always music. It's always music. Some other people that might surprise you. One of my friends is a very fine commercial trumpet player, retired now, but he played with Doc Severinsen in the Tonight Show band. He told me Doc played the mouthpiece for 45 minutes before the rehearsal. I know that Maurice Andre had an experience when he was in the French army where he had no trumpet for 6 months, but he had a mouthpiece. He said that at the end of that 6 months, when I put the mouthpiece inside the trumpet, I was playing at a different level. The story that Jake tells us is that when he was sick in the hospital as a child, back in those days, you could be in the hospital for 2 weeks at a time. Now it's like 4 hours. It's unbelievable how the times have changed. But he had no instrument, but he had a mouthpiece. He said when he came out of the hospital, his playing was already elevated to another level. Of course, we know Charlie Vernon, Alan Baer, all the people that I know. And a little story about myself, a very quick story. I know we're running out of time. 3 years ago, I fell on the ice, and I'm not going to go into details, but I had 7 hospitalizations, fractured hip, pelvis, 2 replacement hips, and bladder cancer. And so for 3 years, I could not hold the instrument for more than a few minutes to play a church gig or something. But I practiced with my mouthpiece in a tube and a funnel. And I did that for 3 years. And when I finally had the chance to put the mouthpiece in the instrument, there was I won't say a noticeable difference, there was a major difference. I'm playing with the most resonant and powerful sound that I ever have in my career. And so now 50% of my practice is with the mouthpiece in that small tube. But I recently saw a video. Lou Soloff was interviewed by Mike Gross on YouTube, and the video is still there. And Lou Soloff tells a story about when he had a lesson with Jake. He's about my age, and it was about the time when I was there. And he said that Jake told him to take the mouthpiece out and play a melody. I'm going to repeat it about 10 times. And he says, I want you to imitate all the different trumpet players you know of. Play it like like Maurice Andre, play it like Adolf Hirsch, play it like Gottfried Reicha, play it like Maurice Andre. And he would do that. Then finally he put the, was time came to put the mouthpiece inside his trumpet, and said, Jacob said to him, play it like Lou Soloff. And he described that moment. He said there was a striking difference, a striking difference. You can see the video on it. So here we are. What's the methodology that I'm recommending? I call it sing, buzz, play. Do lots of vocalizing, lots of mouthpiece playing, and transfer the singing, as in buzz words, transfer the singing and buzzing to the instrument. And I recommend a lot of time. And for the players who contact me who are experienced paralysis and extreme malfunction, I recommend that they put the instrument away in a different room. And we spend a lot of time away from the influence of that instrument. But I don't have time to get into that now. Maybe in a future day, we'll talk about the paralyzing impact or influence of the instrument. But we get away from the instrument and then we transfer back to the instrument, the sing, the buzz, the play.
So Roger, we're running out of time, but I do have just a couple of quick questions from the chat box.
Before the questions come, we're going to move into the finale ultimo, and it's only 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds. But this is important, the finale ultimo, and as many questions as you want after that. But we must hear these words from the master.
The emotion, the story, there's the story. This is exactly what I love to teach, the ability to communicate. We do this in so many things in life. We can transfer it to music once we understand that we do tell a story. In other words, there's emotion in music. There's anger, there's love, there's surprise, there are wonderful lines. We have so many things inherent, in a sense, in living that can be expressed in music. And this actually, I think, is what it's all about. I don't care if a person plays all wrong if he sounds great. When you're delivering messages to somebody else, you should not be analyzing what you're doing. There's always feedback. There's always a subconscious awareness. There's always minor feedback going on. So you'll know pretty much what you're doing, and there will be certain field phenomena, but it should be in 10%, 20% of the intellectual capacities. 80 or 90% should have to do with the message and the delivering of the message so that somebody can receive it. We cannot allow this self-evaluation. What the brass player is dealing with, psychomotor activity, the part of the brain that has to do with issuing the message is the same part that receives messages. By that, I mean the volitional thought. When I talk to you, you hear me. But when you respond, you're delivering messages to me. You're dealing with motor systems, not sensory systems. Now, we have to make sure the dominance, when you impart knowledge, is through motor systems, not through sensors. You can't take for granted that you're going to deliver a message if you're analyzing the various mechanisms of deliverance or even analyzing the message. Actually, when you communicate to somebody else in speech, you have the key for communicating with music.
Thank you, Master. What a wonderful way to end that time.
Okay.
Fire away. What have you got?
All right, we got a couple of quick questions. One person wants to know what part of California Mr. Jacobs was from.
You know, I honestly don't know the Pacific
area.
I think it was Southern California, but I'm not sure about that. Didn't matter. Didn't matter.
Okay. What would Mr. Jacobs do to help a student who could not produce a buzz or produce a note on the mouthpiece or the instrument?
Well, we always start with the buzz. And I asked them to buzz their lips, make a buzzing sound with their lips without the mouthpiece there. That's where we start with it. Just make this buzzing sound. Make that sound. And then we put the mouthpiece there while they're buzzing. One of the things that I used to do many years ago with the brass quintet, we used to do educational concerts. and we did a thing called tuba concerto. And we would have a young child come up on the stage, and I had about 20 seconds to motivate them to make a sound inside the tuba. And the other quartet, the members of the quintet would play Pop Goes the Weasel, and they would produce the pop. So I always would just point to my finger, and I'd say, I point my finger, make this sound. And they would make a sound. Then I would put the mouthpiece there, and I'd say, here we go. You're going to make that sound inside the mouthpiece. By the way, if somebody's is playing a trumpet, a small mouthpiece, and they're being influenced by the small size of the mouthpiece, I always say, start with a larger mouthpiece. Start with a trombone or a baritone or euphonium mouthpiece to initiate the buzz, because they're sometimes intimidated by the smallness of the trumpet mouthpiece. But it's always, motivation is always based upon sound, the sound of the buzz. Make that sound inside the mouthpiece, and ultimately make sound inside the tuba. We don't talk about embouchure, air embouchure analysis. I didn't have time to get into that, but that was very destructive to me back in 1959 when I came home with a trombone in my hands, and I was instructed to go find a trombone teacher who did nothing but talk about air embouchure analysis. And I spent 4 years after that trying to figure out what that was about. And it was a complete failure. So it's always about sound. Sound motivates function.
Well, thank you very much.